Hello everyone, it's Jade, and for the next couple of months, we're going to be covering Star Trek Enterprise. Last week, we introduced the series and covered episodes 1 through 8. This week, we are covering episodes 9 through 16. So that is Civilization through Shuttlepod One. There is a bit of an off-by-one error in the first couple of seasons because the first episode was a two-parter, so some people consider certain episodes to be 7 or 8 or whatever. Anyway, this set of episodes are way more indicative of the series as a whole and what kind of things we're going to be doing, because character introductions are mostly done with the exception of Malcolm, who is introduced fully in this set of episodes. The writers are sort of in the rhythm, the actors are sort of in the rhythm as well. They have a much better handle on their characters. We really start to see the characters and the ship getting into a routine. The episodes in this set, while important, aren't nearly as structural or introductory as the episodes we covered last week. However, they are more normal to what Star Trek Enterprise is going to be going forward. A few months ago for my graduate program, I did a project on Star Trek The Next Generation. I should go ahead and give credit, I was on a team. What we did was we took all of the scripts of Star Trek The Next Generation episodes and tried to write a program that could predict the IMDb scores of each episode based on just reading the script. We're basically looking for how good is the episode, which characters show up, what kinds of themes are explored, how much technobabble is in it, at what point do the characters figure out a solution and does it seem earned. These kinds of things were what we were trying to identify. And through this, I watched a lot of Next Generation episodes, although I did not finish the whole series and it wasn't necessary for the project. But while we were watching these episodes, it was pretty clear from the IMDb scores exactly which episodes were better or worse than others. Crappy episodes had low scores, and good episodes had high scores. And we all generally agreed with the score that we found on IMDb about whether an episode was good or not. There were, of course, a couple of mild variations among the preferences of the group, but for the most part, our preferences were pretty consistent with that of the consensus. Everybody loves Data, everybody hates Wesley. Data episodes are good, Wesley episodes are bad. But something that I noticed with Enterprise is that my opinion and the opinion of the people who are watching this with me, actually that same team, most of them are actually watching Enterprise with me right now. Not only do we have different opinions from each other, none of us have the same opinion as IMDb. Additionally, there are certain episodes that are widely loved, that have low scores on IMDb, and certain episodes that are widely hated that have high scores on IMDb. This is really interesting. It seems like there's a much larger disparity between what elements people think are good and what elements bother people. The whole cast, in my opinion, is much better balanced as far as how much people like them, potentially with the exception of Archer. I don't think Archer is anybody's favorite character, although I could be wrong. I've never seen anybody online gushing about how much they love Archer. However, basically the rest of the cast is fairly equally beloved. There aren't really certain plot lines that people hate or certain plot lines that are executed especially poorly, so the scores on the website seem a bit more arbitrary. This is something very interesting that I do intend to keep watching out for. I love Data and, okay, both the word data and, numbers, and I also love the Star Trek character. But I'm really interested to see what kinds of things people enjoy about this show and how that's reflected in the IMDb scores and other types of scores over time. I will say that one of the things that most likely impacted these scores the most is the expectations about what Star Trek should be. There are certain things that people associate as being with the Star Trek formula, one of which is definitely not having a theme song with words. There were many, many people who considered the theme song to be an indicator that the whole series was going to be bad, and many people gave up on Enterprise on the first episode, even if they continued watching it, because they really, really hated Faith of the Heart. There are still people on the Star Trek subreddits and forums who talk about how much they hate this song, even though, at the time, having a theme song with words was very common. Even, in shows for adults, not just for children. This was a thing that shows just had. but it mattered way more to people because Star Trek had never had it before. So in some of these episodes that we're going to see today, when the show goes back to its roots and does something that's more Star Trek, it has a higher IMDb score, even if the episode overall is worse or doesn't make sense, or if I personally don't like it. I do want to make a correction from last week. I remembered the significance of TiVo to the show overall. With the advent of TiVo, which came out in 1999, writers, producers, executives could assume that people were more likely to have seen an episode from the previous week. This allowed multiple episode arcs to be expected from the get-go of Enterprise. However, television hadn't totally adjusted to this yet, which is why we have this weird blend of episodic plots and season-long arcs that personally I prefer. This is my favorite type of storytelling, where you do have to watch every episode, and if someone learns a lesson in one episode, they do remember it into the next episode. However, each episode tells an individual story, maybe focuses on a different character, does something else. This is my favorite kind of storytelling. I do miss it a little bit in our current paradigm, where Netflix shows and other streaming shows pretty much record one long movie and just like break it up into 8 to 10 parts. I don't hate it, but I don't really like it as much as what we have here. It does result in this change from the previous shows that allows for the characters to have more flaws, because where the previous shows was more of a slice of life, I mean, this is still a slice of life, but they were way more of a slice of life, where you could believe the characters were going on all sorts of adventures between episodes, and we were only seeing one out of every however many. This show, we see the events that develop the characters and develop the ship and develop the story. Final note before we get into the episodes themselves. Last week I said that I wasn't sure how far I was going to take this video series and how much of the show I was going to watch. I think I have settled on a conclusion, but this is still subject to change. There is another YouTuber that I really like named Jessie Gender. She covers a lot of Star Trek content and gives a lot of opinions that personally I just agree with. Her preferences are very, very similar to mine. She likes the same characters, she likes the same subplots. She also grew up watching Enterprise, so in general, if she likes something, I can assume I will probably also like it. Recently, I stumbled across one of her videos that talks about the book The Good Men That Do. The Good Men That Do is the book that replaces the finale to Enterprise. It retcons it. The Good Men That Do was softly canonized by a background detail in a single frame of Picard Season 2. However, it was clearly deliberate and pretty much can't be interpreted any other way. Jessie said that she thinks this is a good book that should be read by people who were dissatisfied with the ending to Enterprise. So I think that I will enjoy it. And when I'm finished watching the series again, I intend to read it. The big difference in taste between me and this other YouTuber is that she says she can simply pretend in her mind that the original finale of Enterprise didn't happen. I can't do that. I don't have that level of imagination, and I was afraid to watch the ending again because I've written a lot of fan fiction in my life, but that doesn't mean everybody should read it. I was afraid that these books that follow Enterprise were going to be terrible, have poor attention to detail or poor understanding of the characters, but I have faith because I have faith of the heart, because this other very dedicated, detail-oriented Star Trek fan believes that the story is believable and does a good job repairing the damage. I think I will like it, and I think that it can help me kind of get over what happens at the end of this story. So that's the current plan for now. I haven't decided whether I'm going to read the 8 books that follow that, but for now, The Good Men That Do is on the agenda. So the first episode that I watched this week is called Civilization. Civilization is the first one that deals with the topic that almost all of the episodes that we're going to cover this week deal with, which is what is the role of the Enterprise, both now in space and to humanity and to the future. What is the significance of this particular crew in this particular ship right now? In this episode, they find this M-class planet and they really, really want to go down there, but they have to wrestle with the idea of whether they're going to introduce themselves to this pre-Renaissance civilization and potentially taint their development. They eventually decide to go down in disguise, and when they go down there, they find that there is a shopkeeper from another planet who is mining underneath the city and poisoning the citizens. So they have to shut down this guy's mining operation and scare off the aliens who are mining on this planet of innocent pre-Renaissance humanoids, and then they leave and go on to the next planet. This episode is certainly the weakest of the set. It does some important things like introduce the characters to the concept of not tainting other civilizations, and it gives them their very first away mission where they're interacting with humanoids who have never spoken to the Federation before, or Starfleet, or other creatures. But it also does kind of shockingly little with the character that this episode is about, who is Archer. I think that the writers were sort of going back to the drawing board with Archer a little bit around this time. Last week we saw an Archer who was very driven, a little bit aggro. He had a little bit of a blank slate to his backstory where we don't know what his background is. We still don't. We know that his father was an inventor of the warp drive, but we don't really know why he's the captain other than that. It doesn't seem like he's super unqualified, but, was he an engineer? Was he a pilot? They seem to have left some of those details blank in order to decide them later once they had gotten into the rhythm of the story, but those holes are starting to show now. We have an entire hour of Archer working mostly but not entirely alone with this apothecary whom he meets down on the planet, and the only thing we learn about him is that Archer, like all human males, most human males, would jump at the opportunity to spend time with a beautiful alien woman who is kind and driven and cares about her people. That doesn't give me any information, I'm sorry. It doesn't explore his character. It does teach him things, though. Archer learns a lot about the things he's going to need going forward to interact with other species and to do these away missions in this episode. So it is valuable, but it does feel less meaty than basically all of the other episodes we're going to cover today. I do think that there's a really good bit of acting in the middle here where Scott Bakula as Archer is interacting with this apothecary for the first time in a one-on-one setting, and you can see that he's doing his best to appear normal, but he has this undercurrent of awe at the idea that he's speaking to this other alien species, and that is impressive, and I thought he did a really good job there. Like I said, not a whole lot happens in this one. It's pretty straightforward. So before we move on, I did just want to call out something that's going to come back later. I did want to point out there's a point where T'Polla's in control of the ship, and it looks kind of like she might be considering leaving Archer behind after they are told that he was killed, and Trip loses it. He attempts to take over the bridge in the middle of this dogfight. You get the sense that he still thinks of himself as being able to take over in case he doesn't like what T'Pol is doing. It causes the entire bridge to come to a halt in the middle of this dogfight where they all could die, and no one knows what they should do or who they should be taking orders from. I wanted to point this out because I think, and I actually hope, this is going to be the last time this happens. This is probably the third, maybe the fourth time something like this has happened since the beginning of the series, but because we get a lot of development where Archer accepts T'Pol as a fellow leader throughout the course of the next few episodes, we're going to have less confusion about the chain of command going forward. The next episode is Fortunate Son, where we really bring into focus a theme that we're going to see a lot of, if I remember correctly, throughout the rest of the series, which is this appreciation for the blue-collar folk and the working class, and a bit of anti-elitism. Travis is effectively a homeschooler raised in a trade. The captain can weld. The crew attends crappy movie night together instead of orchestra performances. Their uniforms are much more like coveralls. It doesn't seem to have an agenda beyond that, but the show definitely seems to think that we lost something between 2152 and the luxury starliners of future Star Trek shows. However, we do see something here that we're going to see a lot of in the next few episodes, which is a weakness when it comes to approaching moral problems. I don't think this is necessarily permanent. As far as I know, much of the writing staff is swapped out between seasons. So I think it's entirely possible that in season 2, they get a couple of people who have a better understanding and better interest, maybe, in writing good moral problems that are acceptable to Star Trek. However, of all of the moral questions we get in these next few episodes, they are all handled badly. I don't think Fortunate Son is handled disastrously, but the questions that they bring up and the answers that they pose to those questions just don't match. Of course, there are many things that I think the show is doing well. They do a really good job, for example, balancing character individuality with character context and backstory. T'Pol, for example, is an individual in addition to being a Vulcan. Malcolm is a serious, driven person, but he also has his own characterization beyond the stereotypical security chief on a starship that we've seen a couple of times now. I think the cultural problems and racial tension is executed well, and the pace of the character development is obviously something that I keep harping on as being a positive of the show. But all of the moral questions, they feel like they're supposed to do it because it's Star Trek. And I hope it gets better. It's not a massive problem right now, although it will be in a couple of episodes. Let's talk about Fortunate Son. So in this episode, the Enterprise is ordered to go help this freighter that has become damaged in a scuffle with pirates. The freighters take one of the Nausicaans as prisoner while their captain is unconscious. And the first officer, it turns out, is really, really driven to try to make sure these pirates never come back and try to attack them again. Travis thinks he befriends this guy, but it turns out that this guy is really just pretending to be Travis's friend to try to get the Enterprise off their back. He doesn't want these people to find out that he took a prisoner. He doesn't want their help. To the crew of the Fortunate, it's really important that they can take care of themselves, and they don't want outside influence. However, something that is explored in this episode is the fact that going forward, there is going to be more outside influence. There are going to be more human ships in space that are faster, and the freighters are going to have faster engines, so they're going to be stopping and intermingling with people much more often. It's a very strong concept, but the episode lacks a certain tightness. They bring up the moral implications of taking prisoners, but they don't really address it, instead lightly bringing up the logistics of pissing off a superior firepower and the implications for other freighters. So they could have really focused on saying, yeah, you can take this prisoner and you could kill him, but if you kill him, you're raising the stakes for all of the other freighters who didn't ask to be, brought into this. And now the stakes of each of these scuffles becomes much higher because you have pushed the line. They mention this, but they don't focus on it. Instead, the episode is resolved by Travis giving a speech saying that there needs to be more people in space. Well, reiterating to the first officer that he believes people need to be around to man the freighters. And it's not a horrible solution, but it's not a good one. It doesn't address the problems that were brought up at the beginning, although it does address the major theme that the Enterprise is going to be ushering in this new era. I do want to say that the baby joke at the beginning is easily in the top 2 jokes from this set. I do love the fact that this show has a real sense of humor that a lot of the other shows don't. There are several jokes per episode, and they don't take away from the seriousness. The sense of humor is very mild, and you have to be paying attention to even catch it, but it's very good. I find myself laughing at least 4 or 5 times per episode, and I really appreciate it. It shows a confidence in the writing and the characters, and it also shows like a positive energy among the cast and among the writing crew and whoever else is involved. I generally see it as a good sign. It makes every episode feel like a treat, even if the plot is not very good. I think what's interesting about this episode from the perspective of it being a Travis episode, which this is the first real Travis episode. Okay, so I guess we can say not everybody but Malcolm was introduced last set, but this is the first real Travis episode. I wrote, he's the only boomer on the ship, and while he seems to get along with everyone, he jumps at the opportunity to make a friend for his old life and talk about old times. Unfortunately, you cannot go home again. Everyone on the Enterprise sees him as a boomer, but the freighters see him as someone who left. He isn't a boomer anymore. This episode is about how space for humans is changing, and everyone will have to change, as told through the story of Travis, who is changing just by being here. Even if Travis doesn't feel like he's changed a lot, the way people perceive him has changed. And he made the decision to be here. He had to be different than the people who decided to stay in some way. The fact is that these communities will need to change. With more frequent stops to planets, their children will intermingle with other cultures. With more ships, the crews will not be as insular. Their culture will change, and it will potentially actually die out. And that's kind of a bittersweet thing, right? You know, is there a point to preserving the culture of these space freighters who are going to cease existing soon? They are already resisting the idea that they're going to need faster warp engines in order to continue doing their jobs, because it means that their way of life is going to change significantly. The only other thing I wanted to say about this episode is that I kind of wonder if Paramount told them that the first officer was not allowed to kill this prisoner, because remember, kids are watching this too, which is kind of a bizarre thing for them to be saying at this point. Just speculation on my part. Next we have Cold Front. I noticed last week, but I didn't bring it up, that we don't really lose red shirts on this show. Next episode we're going to learn that there are 83 people and 1 dog on the Enterprise. And I just want to compare that to the Enterprise D, the ship from The Next Generation. That has a maximum crew capacity of 15,000 people. So the Enterprise D can lose red shirts basically as much as they want to, but if somebody dies on the NX-01, it's a big problem. They can't replace it with somebody else. There's some adage that your brain can keep track of relationships with 150 people. And that's about half. I mean, it's a little over half, of course, but if there are 83 people in the ship, you know every single one of those people, you probably have an opinion on them, and there's a damn good chance they're your friend. This is the first time we lose a crew member, and it's important that it hits hard, and that it feels important, and it feels important to the characters, because we're going to be losing red shirts less often on this show. The loss of Daniels is a 1.2% loss in the overall crew capacity of the Enterprise NX-01. 1.2% adds up quickly. So what happens in this episode is the crew rolls up on this stellar something, you know, there's this eruption happening in this star nursery or something like that. And it happens every 11 years, and there's a group of religious pilgrims who come and visit it. They meet up with these religious pilgrims, and the two crews start to intermingle and get along. Phlox goes on a little field trip where he goes over and spends the night with their crew just to learn a little bit about their culture, learn a little bit about their religion. I will say I really love Phlox in this episode. I love the fact that they are showing that he has this hobby of learning about other cultures and other religions. It's easy to come up with the concept of a character who is interested in humans, and that's why they're on a ship. We've had that many times in Star Trek, but with Phlox, they take it to the next level and build a whole character out of that idea. Why does Phlox specifically want to be on this ship? Why does Phlox want to learn about humans? Because this is his hobby. He's like any basic person on Tinder who writes on their bio, I love to travel, except taken up to 11. It really makes his character pop. However, I was writing the summary for this episode when I suddenly made this little note to myself, hang on, what happens if the Enterprise blows up? Because what happens is they pass by this ion storm, there's an overload in something about the reactor, but one of the pilgrims, who's actually an agent from the future, unplugged something, preventing the charge from making its way to the warp core, which nobody would have done otherwise, because you don't willy-nilly go unplugging cables on a starship. But because this person knew that this was going to happen, they decided to save the ship. So we've got these two factions that are fighting this temporal Cold War. We've got the faction that Daniels is involved with, who is mostly human, and we've got the faction that Silik is involved with. And Silik's faction thinks that it's beneficial to have the Enterprise alive. And in the future, whatever happens with the Enterprise, it continuing to exist, is positive. So we have to assume that Silik's side of this wins, because we know from later Star Treks that they are still making Enterprises. You know, I I don't think that all of the rest of the flagships would be called Enterprise if the very first Enterprise made it, 2 months out of space dock and then blew up due to a stupid mistake. So then we've got Daniel's side, who is fighting against that, but he's also a good guy. And there was an episode of Strange New Worlds this week that dealt a little bit with time travel, and I had to consciously stop myself from thinking about the time travel. It was so... I'm sorry, Strange New Worlds is good. Like, I didn't want to start this episode bitching about Strange New Worlds, but Strange New Worlds doesn't try to make the time travel aspects make sense. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, you go, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Actually, it's blatant even in the episode. However, with Strange New Worlds, they kind of ask you to just accept it. They go, yep, this is silly. That's okay. Pay attention. But with Enterprise, they don't qualify it and say this is silly. They want you to maintain your suspension of disbelief because they want you to believe it. And I can't. I don't typically like time travel plots, although I don't hate them. It's difficult for me to care because I know that they are not going to pay enough attention for me to be able to actually figure it out, usually. I don't even know if they know where this is going. Maybe I will be proven completely wrong, and maybe this is going to be like a totally brilliant plan that they wrote out a couple of years in advance, but I don't get that sense. It already doesn't seem like it makes sense. If the Klingon Empire was supposed to be destabilized in episode 1, and it already isn't, but Daniels is from 1,000 years in the future, the timeline is already fucked. Like, the butterfly effect has already made this whole timeline incomprehensible just from that one event. So we're just gonna have to move on. There are some things that we can actually make observations. For example, with the Suliban, we know that Silik doesn't know what they want, and we also know that Silik is kind of a disgruntled employee at this point. He hasn't gotten everything that he wanted, and he has displeased his boss, so it's entirely possible that at some point Silik flips. That has been introduced. That is something that is purposeful. That's something we can predict. At the end of the episode, Daniels is killed by Silik, and Silik kind of leaves, and Archer is shaken, and that's the episode. Next we have Silent Enemy. This is our first real Malcolm episode. The show kind of lampshades the fact that we haven't learned about Malcolm by baking it into the episode. They say that the reason we haven't learned about Malcolm is because Malcolm doesn't really want to be learned about. I love this episode. Malcolm is my favorite this week. The importance of food to this show really adds to the feeling of family, which is vital to the whole feeling of Enterprise. When I was in high school robotics, one of my coaches would say that he could tell the difference in the performance of a team based on whether or not they ate meals together. Teams that ate meals together had a better sense of coherence, a better investment in their robot and in their performance, and it was reflected on the field. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but I do think that I believe this. And the Star Trek Enterprise writers seem to believe this as well. Food is so important to this show. Food is how people express love, and there are no replicators in this show. There's something kind of like a replicator. I'm kind of unclear on their meat situation, but they have a hydroponics garden on the ship somewhere, and there's a chef who cooks meals with those hydroponic ingredients. And if there's a steak, it didn't come out of the wall. The chef prepared it. And I think the Enterprise writers feel like something was lost in later Star Trek when they could just order a meal out of the wall. This idea that everybody's eating the same thing and it has nothing to do with their preference, they're eating together, is something that is very important to the ethos of the show. We get a couple of episodes with a plot that has something to do with food. We had the pecan pie episode last week. We see the characters eating at least once per episode. We have the importance of food in the Shuttlepod episode, where they talk about what they're eating and the significance for a little bit. And in this episode, we have the entire crew kind of working together to figure out what Malcolm's favorite food is. This all ties into the ethos of this episode, which is that Malcolm is a person who is not easy to get to know. Even his own parents have no idea what his favorite food is. And throughout the episode, Hoshi is going around talking to various members of the crew and asking them, what do you think about Malcolm? What do you know about Malcolm? And everybody is just like, I don't know. But during the episode, they're being chased down by this alien ship, and they have to basically jury-rig some terrible extra guns that draw power from the impulse engines in order to fight, and generally just like draw power from the whole ship. So every time they shoot, they suffer massive power failures to the other systems. However, without this, they would have died. It's definitely the most desperate situation they've been in, because most of the other episodes, I'm kind of blanking on all of them, but most of the other episodes, the actual ship was not in danger. It was only like the away team, or a shuttle, or an individual. But this time, the actual ship is repeatedly in danger and being hunted down by somebody who wants to kill them. And you can see Archer really start to think about his leadership at this point. You can see him thinking about whether he needs to take the ship back to space dock, which is something that he actually plans on doing. They're trying to go back to Earth. But at the conclusion of the episode, they don't, because Trip and Malcolm are able to convince Archer that any repairs they need to make, any fabrication they need to do, they can do on the ship. Trip gets actually the first inspiring captain speech of the entire series that anybody does, which is when he's inspiring his engineers to do something dumb, basically. I loved it. I also appreciated the speech that Trip gives to Archer to give him some of his confidence back about whether or not the crew can do this, basically. So at the end of the episode, it turns out that nobody knows what Malcolm's favorite food is, but Phlox is able to look in his medical file and find that he's allergic to bromelain, which is a chemical that is found in pineapple, but he actually takes a shot to be able to eat it anyway. So they take an educated guess that pineapple is his favorite food, and they are proved to be correct. They list all of his allergies, and it says he's allergic to like tree nuts and pollen and like grass. And as soon as I heard this, I immediately thought, no wonder he went to space, he's allergic to Earth. But then I realized, I was just kind of sitting there and I went, hang on, I can hear this echo from watching this show the first time something teen years ago, and I think my dad actually said exactly that when we were watching this episode for the first time. I could just hear it in his voice, and it was just a cool moment. I also totally agree. I'm a pineapple freak. I want pineapples on my burgers. I want pineapples on pizza. I want it in curry. I need pineapple every day. If I was allergic to it, I would definitely take that shot. But I also appreciate that when they give him this cake at the end that it has pineapple in it, they make the emotionally intelligent decision to turn this into like a 4-person party. It's not a big party for the whole ship. They realize over the course of this that Malcolm's not close to a bunch of people. Let's just get together the people he actually knows, and we're going to have a cake together. Which was just very sweet. I liked it. So I got to take a little bit of a detour to talk about Soul Eater. When I was about 14, I started watching Soul Eater, which was an anime that came out in 2009 about a girl, but it was a shonen, which means it was like an action series. It's one of the only shows that was an action series with fight scenes and that kind of stuff, but it had a female protagonist. Specifically, it had a female protagonist I could project myself really, really hard onto. She generally had my build and personality and temperament and my hair color and eye color, and I loved Soul Eater because of this, as well as like legitimate reasons to like it. And then I read the manga, and the thing about the manga is that at the beginning the artist is really not good at drawing. Like, spectacularly bad. You can tell he just doesn't really know how to draw. And the way he compensates for this is by adding more tits. As the series goes on, he learns how to draw. There are less tits. I mean, there are still tits. But at the beginning, you get panty shots. You get bare tits all the time. And even when I was like 14, when I was reading this, I saw it as a sign of insecurity. I was like, you're not actually trying to make something that's appealing. you're afraid that people are going to stop reading, and you're begging them to keep reading by putting in more tits. In particular, there's this one trope that I really, really hate. Like, this is my least favorite trope of anything. I think the world would be better if it didn't exist, which is called the fun bag airbag. A fun bag airbag is when two characters, male and female, like fall over, and the guy falls into her tits and like mushes his face around in her tits. And it's an accident, and they move on from it, and it doesn't mean anything. It's just like a fantasy, you know, look, this guy got to mush his face into a woman's tits without having to have the appropriate character development or relationship development in order to be allowed to have access to her tits, like, on purpose. I really, really hate this trope. It makes the world worse. Avengers 2 uses it. Justice League uses it. The moment I see a fun bag airbag, I check out. I don't think there's anything wrong with tits. People can put their tits out as far as they like, but the difference is the intention. You know, if you have a character who is a temptress or a flirt or who just thinks she's very pretty, that's one thing. But it's another thing for her, basically her agency to be taken away by having some character like fall into her tits. It's not purposeful, it's not characterful, it doesn't contribute to the writing, it literally just exists so that the male people in the audience can go, God, I wish that were me. It's bad, lazy, terrible writing, and the moment it happens, I lose respect for whoever made that decision. Notably, the person I'm talking about in both of the previous two examples was Joss Whedon. But the point is that, like, when I see a character being over-sexualized in a way that does not further the plot, I assume it's insecurity. Now, I'm not talking about something like Bridgerton. Like, Bridgerton is supposed to be sexy. You're watching it partially to see those sex scenes, right? Like, it's a sexy show. Enterprise is not Bridgerton. Obviously, the character I'm talking about is T'Pol. You can tell when they are less confident in an episode by how much focus we put on T'Pol's tits. In the first episode, they were like, man, we really, really need to make sure that people keep watching. And there are like 6 shots directly on her tits where her face not even there. Throughout the rest of the episodes, you can tell they're like, ooh, we didn't really have enough time to iron this one out. Let's give her a little extra lip gloss. And it's distracting, but it's not like horrible. I think the series doesn't fundamentally disrespect T'Pol. She's an incredibly weighty character whose dialogue is clearly given a lot of extra attention. She's the character around which other characters' development centers, and her internal landscape is clearly developed with a lot of care, but there are some episodes where she delivers the same dialogue in the same way, but the camera is zoomed out slightly so that her tits are like perfectly centered on the screen. And in episodes where they think that the episode's going to do badly, she looks prettier. And the thing about Dear Doctor is that you can tell they thought they had something gold here. They really thought this was the episode that was going to make people go, oh my god, Enterprise is amazing. And the way you can tell that is because they never showed T'Pol's tits. This is supposed to be a serious, brilliant episode, and it sucks. It sucks. This episode is so bad. It has an 8.0 on IMDb. It's the 3rd highest rated episode in this season, and it is also the episode that lost a huge amount of viewership for the show. There are 2 episodes in the entirety of Enterprise that cause a noticeable, measurable dip in the number of people who watched it the next week, and this is one of them. It's because it's so stupid. It's bad. I hate this episode. And the problem is that when you're watching it, for the first 35 minutes, it seems brilliant. It seems like they're really trying to do something here. This episode is about Phlox. We see his morning routine. And it's charming. We get to see him interact with his little creatures. It's adorable. The beginning of this episode is fantastic. There's this dramatic voiceover throughout the episode where he's talking to his friend who lives on his human friend who's living on Denobulus. I don't remember the name of the planet. And he's telling him about his life and telling him about how difficult his job is on the Enterprise when he has to follow Archer's instructions, but it might not morally be what he wants to do. They come across the species that is dying. They're on a planet with two coexisting sentient species, one of which is more advanced than the other, and the more advanced species is dying of a mystery disease. They have come out into space to try to find a species that can help them after they've been visited by a couple of other more capable species. So T'Pol tells them, hey, we are totally morally in the clear to help these people. They already know about space. They know about warp drives. So Archer tells Phlox, we need to help these people. They are dying. They have asked for our help. And Phlox starts working on a cure, but he realizes that the other sentient species is just a little bit more intelligent than they seem. So he decides to allow the more intelligent species to die because he thinks it's necessary for the development of the less developed species. And he talks to Archer about this and is eventually able to convince Archer that the more developed species needs to die. Fuck this episode. It believes in itself so hard. It takes itself so seriously. It's so, what's the word? Pretentious. It's so pretentious. It says it's impossible for there to ever be a planet in the whole universe where there are two sentient species. The thing is that if the Menk didn't exist, they wouldn't have sentenced the other species whose name I don't remember to death. It was the existence of the Menk that caused them to decide not to save them. If it wasn't for the fact that the Menk were there, they would have totally just given them the cure and left, and it would have been a feel-good episode where everybody clapped each other on the back. It's not well thought out. The reasons... It's the same problem that Fortunate Son had. The reasons that Phlox gives for each of his decisions throughout the episode are completely incongruous. At one point he talks about how the humans have a lot of compassion and moral, objection to the way the Menk are treated because they are given food but also kind of enslaved, but it's not really clear. They don't actually say slaves. The Menk are developing their own language and all that stuff. I think it was kind of like the other episode in that they weren't allowed to make it too dark, and that caused the episode to suffer. If they had been able to say, okay, the Menk are a race of slaves who are being genuinely mistreated, then you maybe would have had something here. If one thing that I was thinking is maybe they were cannibals, maybe the Menk were a food source, and there was no other way for them to survive. But that's not what happens. They are literally just two species who happen to live on the same planet. This makes no fucking sense. Are we supposed to say that, between the Vulcans and the Andorians, because they're from the same solar system? I think they're from the same solar system, right? They're neighbors, right? They're in conflict with each other, so therefore the Andorians, who are less developed, are eventually going to overtake them, so we should just kill all the Vulcans, right? That's what this episode says. It's not well thought out. It's pretentious and dumb. And originally the plan was that Phlox was going to make this decision by himself and not tell Archer. But Paramount said, no, we can't have these seeds of division in the episode because Archer needs to always look like he knows what the hell he's doing, and he needs to know what's going on his ship. It basically emasculates is the wrong word, but the equivalent of emasculates for captainship Archer if he doesn't know that Phlox did this, and we can't have that. Archer has to look good. And instead, this episode makes both Archer and Phlox look bad. And also, it makes it look like the writers have no fucking clue what they're doing. If, however, we had gone forward with the original plan, I don't know if that would have worked either, because what that episode would have said is that Phlox is willing to betray the ship, and he's willing to play God, and that Phlox is willing to keep these secrets where he basically commits genocide. And we're going to have to know that about Phlox going forward for the rest of the series while nobody else does. And I think, honestly, they could have done something really interesting with that because, like I said, most of the character work in this has been incredibly purposeful. They could have absolutely done something really interesting with this. But it would have made the audience hate Phlox in episode, 12? And that wouldn't have been good. Next, we got the Gas Giant episode. I honestly wonder if Dominic Keating just showed up to the set with a cold and they were like, shit, we gotta make something out of this. So they kind of decreased his involvement in the episode and put in a scene where he's being inspected by Phlox and told to, rest as much as he can, so that people wouldn't question the fact that he had a scratchy voice and wasn't doing very much. I like this episode. It's a good, strong episode where it doesn't super matter a whole lot. It's kind of more of a generic slice of lifey. Of course, they experience things, they do stuff in this episode, but it's not one of the big, massive episodes, but it's just solidly executed all around. They come across this ship full of Klingons who have been injured, and they get into a little bit of a conflict over whether they should allow them to die, but then they get stuck on this gas giant where their ship can't handle the pressure. It's not rated to handle the pressure. And the away team, which is T'Pol, Malcolm, and Hoshi, need to figure out a way to get back up to a level of lower pressure so that the Enterprise can rescue them. It's a good episode where we see them figuring things out, kind of similar to Silent Enemy, where they have to make a couple of engineering changes to the ship, they have to try a couple of things that don't work, and I like that kind of thing. I also appreciate the fact that this one has a couple good, solid, funny moments. But the most important thing that happens in this episode is that Archer actually has a pretty important arc. He realizes when he's communicating with the Klingon captain, I don't remember if she was the captain, but when he's communicating with the Klingon that they capture, he realizes at first that his normal method of communication is not going to work, and if he's going to strike a deal with her, he has to communicate like a Klingon. He has to appeal to her Klingon sensibilities. Okay, I'm sorry. I remember the captain is somebody else. But in order to get her help, he has to deal with her the way Klingons deal with each other. And this is an incredibly important lesson for Archer to learn, and he learns it just in time because the very next episode he's going to use it dealing with T'Pol. I do want to say that Hoshi gets some incredible development this episode. She doesn't get a whole lot of screen time, but I really like what we're seeing her do here. Hoshi initially started out as this just kind of a character who is afraid of things. It becomes less afraid of things. But we're taking it steps farther. It's just like with Phlox, with discovering other alien cultures and stuff. We're seeing Hoshi take her character concept farther and build a whole person out of it. She was afraid, but now she wasn't afraid, and now she wants to learn more about these cultures. That it's her job to learn about these cultures, but she wants to take it to the next level. She asked T'Pol to teach her a little bit about Vulcan emotion control. She seems to be displaying more interest in learning about the space that they're in. And I'm really excited to see where her character development goes, because she's sort of the girl next door of the Enterprise, right? Like, she's the normal girl, and she definitely had the potential to be kind of a flat character, but she's not. She's everybody's friend. She's charming and excited about what they're doing, and we get to see her excitement grow and why it grows, and I really like that. Next we got Shadows of P'Jem. This might not be the best episode, but it is the most important, I think. This ties directly into Archer's actual arc, which is becoming a better leader, a better representative for humanity, and a better ambassador to other cultures. In this episode, he really realizes and commits to the fact that he needs to do all these things, and he needs to focus really hard on achieving it. Something I realized after I finished recording last week's episode was T'Pol is very much like a cat, and the first thing we find out about Archer is that he is a dog person. If you've ever talked to a dog person who doesn't like cats, they're always like, cats are evil, I went up to one and tried to pet it and it didn't like me. And I feel like that pretty much describes Archer and T'Pol's dynamic in the first couple of episodes. She's not particularly smiley or friendly because she's never met Archer before, and that frustrates the living hell out of him. But now it's been 6 months, and he's like the dog owner who had to take care of a cat for 6 months, and then when it comes time to give the cat back, he realizes just how much of a routine he has with the cat, and how much the cat has become part of his family. So in this episode, the Vulcan High Command basically sees the Enterprise as being at fault for the destruction of the P'Jem Monastery, which they visited last week, and they decide that, well, last week in my terms, they decide that the person who is at fault here is T'Pol, because she was supposed to be taking care of, watching over the Enterprise and making sure they make the best decisions for the Vulcan High Council and for the sake of the Vulcan people. So they recall her, and they basically tell Archer to give her back, because they want to make an example of her back on Vulcan. she's the first Vulcan to have served on a human ship for longer than a couple of weeks, and they want to show, like, this is what you should not do, pretty much. But this basically is an attack on Archer's self-worth as a leader. The Vulcans are basically saying that it doesn't matter that Archer's the captain. T'Pol is responsible for his actions and the actions of the crew in their eyes. He's a non-entity who has less power over his first officer than the people that he hates does. So this situation really forces him to sit down and think about his leadership and the lessons he's learned in the past couple of episodes, as well as what he actually thinks about the Vulcans. And he decides to take one last field trip with T'Pol in a desperate, emotional, sentimental move. On the way down to the planet, they get kidnapped. He takes an opportunity to try to talk to her about the situation. Trip, who is in charge of the ship, gets into a pissing contest with the Vulcans who come to pick her up. And then he and Malcolm go down to the planet where they get kidnapped also. They team up with some Andorians to mount a rescue mission. On the way there, they meet the Vulcans, which turns into an even bigger pissing contest until T'Pol ends up having to take a shot for the captain of the Vulcan ship, which Archer is able to leverage into getting the captain of the Vulcan ship to basically get her forgiven for what happened at Basham. He gives her the option to stay or leave. She decides to stay. Most of all, this episode kind of solidifies the team change that we've seen in T'Pol through the last couple of episodes in Archer's eyes. Archer and the show's anti-elitist views used to see T'Pol as this elite, right? But now this is happening. In Archer's eyes, T'Pol is an underdog, which makes her part of his team. Because she's being punished for his actions, she is another victim of the Vulcan High Council. And he even has this line at one point in the episode. He says, "The Vulcan High Council took something very important from my father, and I'm not going to let them do the same thing to me." And that's the point where, in his eyes, T'Pol becomes, separate from the Vulcan High Council. Vulcans are individuals to him now, and thank God, because I was thinking before this that it was going to take a big gesture from Archer to become tolerable in my eyes, frankly. He pissed me off so bad, and I was going to need him to really, really have an epiphany and put in the work to treat T'Pol correctly for me to see him as a good captain. And I was afraid they weren't going to do that because for the last couple of episodes, they've just kind of been ignoring that plot line. But this episode and what happens in it is exactly what I wanted. In the past couple of episodes, we've seen him calm down around her. We saw him be convinced that she had nothing to do with the spy station. We saw him think about not trusting her but decide to believe her during Silent Enemy. We saw him learn how to deal with Klingons, and now he has every necessary tool in his belt, so that in the 11th hour, when it's all on the line, he can suddenly pull out this laser accurate analysis of her character to show that he does know her and he does care despite everything that's happened up until now. First is the moment in the shuttle pod where he sort of gives her the option to go back to the ship, and she rationalizes. She says, no, I would like... She doesn't say she wants to go down to the planet with him. She says it would be a waste of fuel to go back. And you can see Archer have this moment of like, oh my god, that worked. He realizes that in order to communicate with her, to get her needs and her wants, he has to allow her to basically fake rationalize whatever it is she actually wants. She'll come up with a reason why she wants whatever it is that she wants, but he has to allow her to come up with that reason and pretend that it's logical, pretty much. And then he uses this throughout the episode. He motivates her with reverse psychology in order to get out of the bindings that they're in. He correctly identifies that she blames herself for the Pajem incident and that she just wants to go home because she thinks she's becoming too human, which she is. We can all see that she's becoming way more cozy with the humans than she pretty much ever anticipated she would be. But at the end of the episode, he uses this, like, allowing her to rationalize thing to let her choose where to go. It's important to her dignity that she can still sort of, I guess you could say, pretend to be a Vulcan. I mean, of course she's still a Vulcan, but at the end of the episode, he asks her, he tells her, if you want to go back to Vulcan, you can go talk to that captain and he will take you home. And she goes, no, Phlox told me that I am not allowed to get up. I'm on bed rest, which is a bullshit reason. She could have easily come up with literally any other way to talk to that captain, but she had to come up with that logical reason so that in her mind, she rationalized it. And now that Archer realizes that this is how her brain works and how she communicates, things between them will be so much better. Archer hasn't seen it, even though the audience has, because he didn't want to. He didn't see her as an ally, but now he does. This episode does kind of ask us why T'Pol has stayed on the Enterprise when no other Vulcan has lasted with a ship full of humans, and while it's not totally clear, we can make a couple educated guesses. Initially Archer saved her life. Trip is unusually stubborn as to communicate with her. Like in the first episode, we see sort of the way, that I described last week, the way the three of them communicate that works for T'Pol when it might not work if either Trip or Archer wasn't there. Because of this, she kind of had this foot in the door that allowed her to be receptive to the other humans on the ship. And finally, you can tell the writers think that T'Pol is the coolest character ever because all of the other characters think that T'Pol is the coolest character ever. All the other characters just really love her and admire her. And I think that makes her feel special in a way. And that, of course, contributes to her wanting to stay on the ship. I did like that Phlox warns her about the surprise party. Don't throw a surprise party for someone who is as closed off as T'Pol. It's not going to work. However, we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to talk about the Andorians again later. But I really appreciated how characterful the interactions with Shran are. He's such a tsundere. Like he can't admit that he appreciates what Archer did for him. He went to all this length to pay back Archer, and then he just kind of runs off because he's embarrassed. He's like a schoolgirl. I can't wait to see him again. However, I do have to bring up something, and I can't not say it. All the nice things about this episode go out the window with one additional factor. The odd, blatant, and more than distracting quantity of fetish material that is pervasive throughout this episode. It starts with something that isn't even blatant as fetish material. It's the fun bag airbag scene. Yes, I brought that up earlier so that we could talk about this episode. In the middle of this episode, Archer and T'Pol fall over, they're tied together, and she smushes his boobs into his face. And I hate that trope. It makes me check out. Like I said, it's the worst trope that there is. But it's totally displaced from the tone of the episode. Neither character acknowledges it or even seems to react to it, which makes me suspect that it wasn't in the script. This tells me, along with some other things that we're just going to talk about in a second, this tells me that this was not in the script. This was in the production design, and this was the director or a producer. I don't think this was in the script because of the next couple of details. What follows after this is that the characters are tied up, but anyone with even the bare minimum of exposure to bondage knows that this is a shibari, like, I forget what the word is, like a hog tie for, it's sexual. Like, it looks like a sexual bondage style of tie. I've never seen this used in any other TV show. It's deliberate and blatant, and you don't have to be into the BDSM scene to recognize it. You have to have eyes. After that, they are forced to eat oatmeal, lying down on the ground tied up with their fingers. It's clearly fetish material. You could put this scene on a porn site and people would think it's the introduction to a porn. And for some people, it is porn. It's humiliation in the kink term. This episode is fantastic. It changes a lot in terms of character dynamics and makes Archer a hell of a lot more likable. It gives us more exposure to the Andorians in a less sinister capacity, solidifies the leadership that defines the crew, but it almost doesn't matter how good it is. If you have a fantastic scene in, I don't know, Game of Thrones, like picture your favorite scene from Game of Thrones that, is dramatic and characterful, but then you've got some, like, dude in the background trying to fillet himself. It's distracting. It doesn't matter how good that episode is. You know that to somebody hijacked this episode and turned it into their own personal pornography. And the reason I have to talk about this is that this is the reason the show was canceled. There is an episode that we're coming up on that does this to such an extent that the viewership dropped and it never recovered because people didn't want to watch this with their children. People were grossed out by the fetish material and they didn't have faith in the show anymore, no matter how good the story is. It doesn't matter how solid your writing is if you put in weird-ass fetish material blatantly on screen so that the whole world can see it. And if it wasn't for this, not this episode, but the episode that's coming up, but this general pattern, if it wasn't for this, the show might have completed. The show might have run its full planned 7 seasons. So we're going to keep talking about it. Sorry. Shuttlepod One is the last episode we're covering today. This is definitely the best one. I love this episode. I remembered a lot of it from when I was a kid because it's so funny and charming and good, but also this is definitely the cheapest episode we've seen so far. There's 2 sets, there's like 1 CG shot. We don't see anything we haven't seen before. I think only like 5 members of the cast even show up. Trip and Malcolm get into a shuttle and they think that the ship exploded and they're just kind of adrift in space for a couple of days by themselves. And it's fantastic. There's a little bit of redundancy in the cast qualities, but it works to build chemistry and provide parallels rather than make everyone feel redundant. Trip and Hoshi are both warm, friendly types, but they don't feel like copies of each other because for Trip it comes from a place of leadership, and from Hoshi it comes from somewhere else. He'll get aggressive when he's upset. She will crumble. Previously, we knew that no one wanted to get to know Malcolm, but in this episode, we explore a few more of Malcolm's flaws, why no one really knows him, and it's not in a way that makes us dislike him. One thing that I really like about this show is we make the characters have believable flaws, but it doesn't impact their likability. This episode is to Malcolm what Trip was to Unexpected, in which he is whiny and annoying, but in a way that is charming and funny. And I like the fact that at the end of this episode, we see a way forward for him. He can actually learn how to get close to people after this episode. And seeing the ship blow up hammers that home. He thinks about all the things that he's missing, all the things he won't be able to experience. He has a fantastic arc this episode. At the beginning, he regrets all the things he's never done and won't do. He realizes what's in front of him. He connects with Trip on a surface level at first, and then at the end, he's willing to die for the sake of their friendship. At the end of the episode, he's alone in sickbay and realizes that Trip was the friend that he needed, more than he needed to pine after any of those girls he was thinking about. He needs companionship before he can have a real relationship, and that's okay. I appreciate Malcolm and Trip's friendship after this episode, but I also hope it's a precursor to Malcolm making more connections in general. I hope we see him opening up to others as much as I hope that we continue to see these two being buddies. There's a lot of really hilarious moments in this episode. Okay, this isn't really funny, but we see T'Pol actually display something like curiosity for the first time when she actually wants to study something, and then she's not allowed to because they have to go rescue the boys. Malcolm sends goodbye letters to like literally every single person he's ever met, including every girl he's ever been on a date with, and he sends like the exact same goodbye letter. It's hysterical. This is the #1 joke. I laughed so hard. We see another focus on food scene. The two characters talk about what they're eating and like what it means to them. We just talked about T'Pol rationalizing what she wanted, but we also see like the flip side with Malcolm and Trip in this episode where they are trying to make a plan, but they're both too emotional to actually think through anything, so they just get snippy with each other and yell at each other. We see in higher detail what Trip's leadership looks like. He can be inspiring and commanding, but he can also get irritable really quickly, as we've seen a bunch of times. But his irritation comes from a place of deep care. He's still the heart, and he wears his heart on his sleeve and offers it to others, and he uses that to be a good leader, which, like I said, it's great character design. He doesn't have a particularly high EQ. He's just completely 100% genuine 100% of the time, and that gets him most of the way there. That makes people trust him. That makes people look up to him. Like I said, Malcolm is definitely my favorite character after this week. Of course, I'll probably pick somebody else next week, but I really liked him. I think Dominic Keating's performance in this episode was fantastic. He does a really great job being annoying in a funny way, and I think that's something that almost all of the characters have mastered, but these two characters specifically have done it really well, and putting them together in this shuttle pod where they're not allowed to leave each other alone for a couple of days is just so funny, and it's also poignant. At the end of the episode, Trip attempts to sacrifice himself so that Malcolm will have enough oxygen to get back to the Enterprise, and they get into this argument that is funny but also touching. Malcolm starts screaming at Trip to get back down into the shuttle pod. Don't throw himself out the airlock because he wants them to die together. And it's just a great episode. This is definitely the best one so far. There's not much else to say. I do plan to do a big analysis of Archer next week over the course of the season. I feel like there was a bit of a bumpy ride on the design of his character. Like I said, there are some things that seem purposeful and other things that are just like, this is what a Star Trek captain is supposed to do. And I want to see where he ends next week. And I want to do like a big analysis of where he started and where he's ended up. I think the things that they have done purposefully with his arc so far have been good, but I also think his character design is lacking compared to, Malcolm, who we've met every single member of his family, and we know what he thinks about all the girls he's ever dated, and how that adds to who he has become, and how that adds to who he will become. Archer's not quite there, but I think they can get him there, and I hope they do. I hope they don't want to give him main character syndrome where he is less developed than everybody else so that he can be the captain. I don't think that's necessary. I think they can pull it off. So next week there will be 9 episodes because there were 25 episodes in the first season. So we're going to cover all of those. It's going to probably take a long time. I will see you at the next one.